want to start this morning by sharing a dream, not really a dream, I guess, it's more of a nightmare with you that I used to have pretty consistently. And I hesitate sharing it with you because, the thing about dreams is they say something about you. And so this definitely says some things about me. But the reason I share it with you is because I think it actually says some things about you too. It says some things about us. And the nightmare that I had it so many times, was that one day my wife would wake up and it was like a light switch got flipped and she decided that she didn't want to be with me anymore. It's just a dream, so it's just a dream. But it felt real. You know those dreams that like you wake up from them and it's like everything that just happened, it felt like it really happened. It wasn't just something in your head. It was like a light switch got flipped and she literally walked out the door of our house without looking back. And the thing about it, what made it, that was absolutely terrible in and of itself, but the thing that made it worse is that I would go after her in this dream and try to talk to her. And I would find her in various places, hanging out with other people, with friends, and I would go and I would try to talk to her, and she would act like I wasn't even there. I would go and be pleading with her, crying and begging for her to come back, and it wasn't that I wasn't there, it wasn't like she literally could not see me, it's not like I was invisible, but she treated me like I was invisible. She treated me like I was nothing, no response, no answers, no reasons, it's just, I'm done with you, and I'm going to pretend like you don't even exist. Now again, I would wake up from that dream just overwhelmed with grief. Sometimes Sarah would tell you I would be just weeping and would wake her up because I had to talk to her, just to check in, make sure she's still talking to me at that point in time. And I know, look, it says some things about me and some insecurities that I've had along the way in my life. But here's the thing. Like I said, I think that dream actually says more about us. And it's two things that I think it says. You can think of them, though, as the flip side of one coin. On the one hand, it says something about a fear that I believe that everybody in the room has, and it's the fear of being rejected. It's the fear of not being loved, especially by the person or people that you would expect to love you most. There's this fear. Do you know what the opposite of love is? It's not anger. The opposite of love is apathy. The opposite of love is saying, you don't matter, you don't care, I couldn't care less about you. You don't matter, it's like you don't exist. One of the worst things that you can do to people is to ignore them. On the other side, it speaks to not just the fear, it speaks to this longing that we have. And here's the longing. It's not just a longing. Yes, it's a longing to be loved, but the longing is to belong. And when I'm talking about belonging, here's how I would define it. And this is my definition. You won't find this in the dictionary, but belonging is a sense of security, significance, and satisfaction that comes from knowing that you are loved, accepted, and affirmed in the context of a committed relationship or committed relationships. People who are committed to you. I'm going to say it again. Belonging is a sense of security, significance, and satisfaction that comes from feeling loved, accepted, and affirmed in the context of committed relationships. One person described it, I think, very well when they said it's like getting up on a platform and feeling like everybody supports you. And see, everybody in the room, we long for that. But we don't just long for it. I want you to get this. You actually need a sense of belonging. There are so many studies that you can go out and you can read. You can look it up online. You can go and Google this. There are so many studies that have been done that have revealed these massive negative impacts that come as a result of feeling like you don't belong. For example, when you feel like you don't belong, it negatively impacts your health. One study showed that there was a massive increase in mortality rates when people felt like they had no sense of belonging in this world. But it's not just physical, and there were other physical problems that came out as this sense of not belonging, but there's also emotional, mental impact on our health. See, the more that we feel like we don't belong, the more our health declines. But let me take you to the emotional side of it. The more that I feel like I don't belong, do you know what comes out? Do you know what people feel when they don't feel like they belong? Depression goes up. Anxiety goes up. stress goes up. And I want you to think about what this means. Last week, we started this series on joy. The subtitle is just 4 ways to have joy now. We're talking about how in the world do you have joy in the real world? Not just one day down the road, but to have real joy today. And what we reminded ourselves of last week is God has intended you for that kind of a joy. God has intended you for a life-shaping, soul-shaking, circumstance-defining joy. God did not create you to be unhappy. God created and designed you for joy. Not just one day in the future. He designed you to experience joy today. We talked about Jesus saying in John chapter 15, he says, I came that you might have joy and might have it to the full. God doesn't want you to have a little bit of joy. He wants you to have the fullness of joy. So how do we get that joy? And so what are the 4? We're talking about 4 ways. Last week we talked about way number 1, which it was, do you remember? It's one word. Hope. Right? When your hope goes down, your joy runs out. It's just the way that it is. In any circumstance, if you look in your life and you find places where you're struggling with joy, I guarantee there is a connection to your hope. There is a place in your marriage, if you're running out of joy, I guarantee it's because somewhere in there you lost hope. In your workplace, it's because you lost hope. With your health, it's because you've lost hope somewhere along the way. And that's why we started this on Easter Sunday, because listen, the reason that we can have, God wants us to have joy, and a joy that can't be taken. The place that we find that kind of joy is in the empty tomb. Why? Because in the empty tomb we find a hope that can never be taken. Because Jesus Christ rose again, he conquered sin, and he conquered death, and he's given us an eternal hope, which means we have an unshakable joy. You want joy, you find it in the context of hope. But this morning, what we're talking about is this. If you want the joy that you were created for, you cannot find it apart from that sense of belonging. You were made to belong. You need to belong. Which, by the way, explains why so many people in our world feel that lack of joy. It's because they have a lack of belonging in this world. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at a passage that's really it's very familiar, but I think, and there's always a danger when we look at a familiar passage that we just assume things and we skim over it without being willing to go deeper into it. And so I think we're going to look at this in a way that is going to be familiar, but I hope it's going to take us deeper than we tend to go. And what we're going to find in this passage are 2 things. Number 1, it's going to tell us the cause. Why is it that so many of us feel no real sense of belonging? Why do we struggle to belong in this world? There's a real reason, but it's also going to give us a cure. That's what we're going to look at together this morning. Would you stand with me? Let's pray together, then we'll read our passage. Father God, thank you for this opportunity to gather together and to open your word. Lord, my prayer is simple. It's God, that as you speak to us through your word, for you are always speaking through your word, that as you speak, that for us here as a community together, that you would give us ears to hear, that we would really be listening to your voice this morning, that you would give us a mind that really understands your truth as it's presented to us through your word. And God, also a heart that's really willing to surrender and say yes. There are things that you want to teach us, places that you want to encourage us, but also places you want to challenge us. And so, Lord, I pray that we would approach this with that willingness to really hear and to really respond. So do great things in us this morning as you show us the truth of who you are. In Jesus' name, amen. We're going to read verse 1 and 2, and then we're going to skip to verse 11. Luke 15, verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, This man receives sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable. Now skip down to verse 11. He actually tells them 3 parables, but we're going to look at the third. Verse 11, and he said, There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. And when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. And you know, when that word celebrate, they began to celebrate with great joy. This is God's word. You can go ahead and be seated. So like I said, this is a pretty well-known story. In fact, I would say this is probably the most well-known parable of Jesus' teachings. It's not just the most well-known, I think it's the most well-loved. Not just by people in the church, I think people around the world love this particular parable. And I'm sure there's lots of reasons for it, but I think it's because it speaks to that longing, the fear of being rejected and the longing to belong. And there's three things that I would say that I see this passage telling us about that. Number one, is that we were made to belong. And this may sound really simple and really obvious, but I think we tend to miss that as the context of this story. You and I were made to belong. Made to have that sense of security and significance and satisfaction where we are loved, accepted, and affirmed in the context of committed relationships. A number of weeks back, might have been even over a month ago, I got an email from somebody from Grace Point Plainfield. They've been around for a bit, and they were connected to a degree in a life group, and they were serving in ministries, and they were connected, and yet at the same time, they felt like there was something that was still missing. And they wrote to me about a particular instance where they were sitting with a group of people that they had been spending time with, but they were listening to everybody kind of talking about all the things that they were doing together outside of this group that they were sitting in. And yet here is this person who is sitting feeling like they're disconnected. Even though they're connected, they're still feeling disconnected, as if they're on the outside still looking in, even though they're a part of it. And they wrote to me, and I actually shared this in an email a few weeks back, but I want to read to you what they said. They said, I realize that these folks, speaking of people in the church, have been friends for years and go way back. Some of us have been around for quite a while. I think it's about 50% of us have been here just in the last few years. But some of us have been friends for a long time, and this person says, I just don't know how to be part of their lives. As I said, I've invited for coffee after church, etc., but no takers. People are super busy and have people in their lives and possibly no space for others. I'm not hurt or angry. I'm just lonely and in need of community. What else can I do? What am I doing wrong? I don't know the answer. Now, I sent that out in an email, and I immediately got some people who were asking me, is that somebody that is in a group that I'm a part of? Is that somebody that I'm ignoring? And there was like a high number of people that are walking around feeling guilty. And the point wasn't to make people feel guilty, but to get people to think. And the point isn't who wrote that, but what they're saying. And I want you to hear what they're saying. Here's just the one line. Listen, I just am lonely and need community. Here's what this person is saying. I want to belong, and I may be present, but I don't feel like I actually belong yet. And what they're talking about there is this need that we all have. And the reason it's a need is because you were created with this need to belong. You were created to belong. And it's the context. Look at the very first verse 11 of the story. He says, and he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. Now, we tend to fly past that as if it's only just the backdrop for the story. Oh, well, there's a man. He's got 2 sons. Now let's move on to the real story. But here, listen to me. This is not just the backdrop for the story. This is the whole point of the story. The point of the story is that we were created in the context of, we were meant to be living in the context of a family-like community of belonging. First of all with God, and second of all with each other. We were created, again, first of all, to have that belonging with God as Father and us as His children. From the very beginning, that was the design. First with God. You can go back to Genesis and you see it. God creates Adam first and doesn't create Eve. Why? Not because he didn't know that he was going to make Eve, not because he didn't know that Adam was going to need an Eve. God intentionally created Adam first by himself. One reason that he did that was to teach Adam that the first place that he was meant to find his belonging was in his relationship with God as Father. And not only are we to relate to God as Father and us as children, get this, we are to relate to God, all of us, as sons. Paul talks about it in Galatians chapter 4, and just track with me on this for a moment because this bothers some people, and I'm going to explain why it shouldn't. Galatians chapter 4, and I'm going to come back to it later on in the message, Paul is talking about how Jesus came so that, he says, we might receive adoption as sons. And see, some people get upset about that because they go, see, the Bible's sexist. It's all about boys and all about men and all about guys. Why isn't it talking about women? Why isn't it sons and daughters? We need to change that. No, we actually don't need to change it because it's not sexist. It's actually going in the exact opposite direction. Because at that time, it was a patriarchal society. And listen, in a patriarchal society, sons had a special place of honor in the family. Daughters were not treated as valuable as sons were. Now, that's not right. It's just the way that it was. Sons, especially eldest sons, had a special level of favor, honor, and blessing in the family because they were the sons. And in this moment, you need to understand what God is saying. God isn't talking about gender. Being sons is not about gender. It's about position, blessing, relationship. And what God is saying is this. Every single person, male and female, man and woman, boy or girl, is meant to have the exact same status and relationship with God. And the status is we're all to have the status of sons. In other words, there's no difference. It's not like, well, men have a special level of favor with God and women are less. It's whether you're a man or a woman, we all have the same status. We're meant to have the same status and relationship with God with the rights of sons. This is the design. He's saying there's no difference. There's no sexism that's going on here. In fact, men and women are being raised to a level of equality in their relationship with God. We are meant to find our belonging, our sense of security, satisfaction, and significance in the context of committed relationship from God where we are loved, accepted, and affirmed. That's what we were made for. First with God, but listen, second with each other. Right? It's a father had two sons. Why not just one son? I mean, again, this is a parable, and so you can't overthink every aspect of this, but there's a reason. Jesus is intentional in the way that he's teaching this. But here's a son who has a relationship with his father, and having a relationship with his father, he also has a relationship with his brother. This is the design. Right? God makes Adam, and then he says, well, we're not done yet. He looks at Adam in the garden, and he says it's not good for him to be what? Alone. We were made first for a relationship with God. We'll find our belonging there, but we were made to find belonging in relationship together as God's children, therefore as brothers and sisters. That's our design. See, that's why you and I, we have this longing. It's why we at times say, I'm lonely and in need of community. It really is a need because you were designed with this need. You were created to belong, to find a sense of that significant satisfaction and security flowing out of being loved, affirmed, and accepted in the context of committed relationship, first with God, but second of all, with people as brothers and sisters being children of God. That's why you long for it, but there's a second reason that you long for it. That's the positive reason that you long for it, but here's the negative reason. The reason that we're all pursuing this belonging is because there's this sense that we have absolutely broken the primary place of our belonging. That's what the story is telling us. See, it's getting to the cause. It says this is the context. We were made for family with God as Father and us as brothers and sisters. But here's what we've done. We've all broken it. We have all alienated ourselves from our place of belonging. First with God and second of all with each other. Right? Look at what it says. The very next thing. The son comes to the father and he says, the younger son, give me my share of property that's coming to me. He's talking about the inheritance. You see, as sons in the family, you are going to get an inheritance from your father. But the design was that wasn't meant to kind of happen later on. It wasn't until either the father was getting close to death or he was going to die when the sons would be taking over responsibility. That's when they would get the inheritance. But here's the son coming to his father. There's no sense that the father is sick or dying. There's no sense of that. The sense is that the son is really self-centered and he's coming to his father going, I want my stuff now. Why? So I can go and live however I want to live. I want the benefits of you as father without your authority. I want your stuff, but not you. That's what he says. And the reason he says that, by the way, is because of joy. I said it last week. Blaise Pascal, the just brilliant French philosopher, he says, the will never takes a step in a direction except to this end, that we are all of us pursuing joy. It's the reason that you do everything that you do. Right? It's the reason that you eat the kind of food that you eat. Right? Some of us are health nuts in the room. Some of us are junk food addicts. Why? Same reason, joy. You eat the food that you eat because of joy. If you eat healthy food, it's because you think it's going to make you feel better. If you eat junk food, it's because you like the way that it tastes. Notice I didn't say that about health food. No, I'm just kidding. Right? You eat the way that you do because you think that it's going to bring joy. Some of us exercise, some of us don't. Why? Joy. Some of us went to bed early last night, some of us stayed up late last night. Why? Joy. The reason that you do everything that you do is because of joy. And what the Son has said is, I want my stuff because I'm going to go find joy apart from you. Which, by the way, is exactly what every single one of us has done with God. It's Isaiah chapter 53, verse 6. All of us like sheep have turned astray. Each of us has gone to our own way. You could change that verse to say it this way. All of us like selfish children have gone to God and said, give us your stuff so we can go to our own way. We've all come to him and said, we want the blessings and benefits of you as God. We want your gifts and your stuff. But here's what we don't want. We don't want your authority. We want to go and we want to live it our own way. And we've rejected him and we've taken our stuff to go and try to find joy apart from him. And what's the result? Well, what's the result for the Son? The Son goes, and for a time, it says he blows it on wild living. Do you understand what that means? He goes and he has fun for a little bit. It's not like, oh man, what a dreary time he had. He went and he partied and he spent money and he did all sorts of things. So listen, there is an attraction. There's a reason that we're attracted to this. There's a pull on us because it offers us a taste of joy, but it's a fake joy because what's the end result? The end result is the pigsty. The end result is that there's a famine that comes to the land. He begins to be in need. He has to sell himself in order to get money, in order to live. He ends up in a pigsty feeding pigs, and he's starving. He wants to even eat what the pigs are eating, which if you've ever seen what pigs are eating, it's disgusting. He wants to eat what they're eating, and it says, and no one gives him anything. Now listen, our tendency in this moment is to go, see, this is what sin leads to. It leads to a pigsty. It leads to brokenness. And we tend to stay on the surface of that. I want to take you a little bit deeper for a moment, and I want to ask you the question, why did he end up in the pigsty? Now, it's really easy for us to go, well, he ended up in the pigsty because he left the Father and he lost his money. True, but there's more to the story than just that. Look at verse 14. Look at what it says. It says, and when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country. So he's going somewhere where he doesn't belong. He's been living, enjoying life, which you got to imagine he's been doing that with people. It's not like he's isolated. He's been partying. He's been living it up. You don't do that by yourself. But then listen, the famine hits and he began to be in need. Now let's just think about this. When you're in need and you have belonging, what happens? Here's what happens. When you have belonging and you have need, people take care of you. Don't they? I mean, real belonging, right? When my kids have need, I don't go, well, too bad. They have belonging. They're a part of my family. So what do? I provide and I care for them. If he was still home with the Father and he began to be in need, what's going to happen? The Father's going to take care of him. Look at the next few verses. In fact, look at the end of verse 16. And he was longing to be fed, so he has to sell himself. Nobody steps up. Nobody's helping him. He's in need in this famine, and nobody's there. So then he has to, the only way he's going to be taken care of, he sells himself, and he's out in the field working with pigs. And look at verse 16. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. See, he has nothing, but why does he have nothing? It's not just because he blew it all, it's because he has no one. He has no one. He's in the pigsty because he has no sense of belonging. See, that's where it ultimately leads. Yes, it leads to a brokenness in life, but it's a brokenness of life that exists because you have no sense of real belonging. It's what happens when we disconnect from the Father. When we alienate ourselves from the Father, it leads to no belonging, not only with him, but with each other. It starts with the Father. I mean, listen, you can go back to the garden. Go back to Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve disconnected from God, when they gave up on their belonging with him, what's the very next thing that happened? They ate from the tree, and what's the next thing that happened? Do you remember? Their eyes get opened, And they become afraid because they realize they're naked, and they run and hide not just from God but from each other, and they put on clothes. Why? Here's why they put on clothes. Because when you disconnect from the ultimate place of belonging with God, it leaves you with a hole inside of you that creates a massive insecurity, and the result is you have to always put on a filter. It's why people put filters on their images that they put on Facebook and Instagram and whatever else it is that people use. Why do we have filters? Why is it that we put a filter on the things that we share? We don't say just anything to anybody. We put filters on the things that we say. We put filters on the things that we post. We put filters on everything in our lives. It's why we dress the way that we dress. We try to pick clothes that look good, and we try to make ourselves look good because why? Here's why. Because we have a deep insecurity and a very deep longing to belong, and yet here's the problem. It doesn't matter how many friends or likes or how much affirmation you get. At the end of the day, the sense that you have when you're living that way is it's never enough, and you never find yourself feeling that you actually belong. Do you know why? Because when you're living that way, you're never actually you. Because you're constantly trying to put your best foot forward. You're always putting something forward that isn't you. You're always presenting a facade of reality. And that might get some acceptance, but you're not actually getting the acceptance. And see, that's what the pigsty is really about. It's not just a place of brokenness. Yes, it's a place of brokenness. Don't get me wrong. Listen, for a Jew to be in a pigsty was just an absolute, the bottom of the pit, because pigs were considered unclean. Like no self-respecting Jewish person would find themselves in a pigsty unless they had to be there. So yes, it's the bottom of the barrel for him, but understand it's not just a location, it's not just a brokenness, it's an experience of not belonging. He's got nothing because he has no one. And here's what that means. That means sometimes, yes, the pigsty is obvious because it's dirty, filthy, and it's just so obvious that you're broken. But do you know what it also means? It means sometimes on the surface, the pigsty looks like a high-powered business office. On the surface, it looks like success, but on the inside, you don't have any belonging. Sometimes it looks like popularity. Sometimes it looks like a big new house. See, it can look beautiful. It doesn't just have to be where we're rolling in the mud with pigs. You can look like you're getting plenty to eat on the outside. On the inside, you're actually starving. It's not just a location. It's an experience of brokenness. And here is this son who has been alienated from the father, but not only has he been alienated from the father, he's been alienated from the family. And he finds himself in a place where he has absolutely no belonging. And see, listen, that's the world we live in. Why? What is the cause of all of this sense that we don't belong? Here's the cause of it. We've alienated ourselves from the place of our ultimate belonging. We've been alienated from God, and as a result, we've been alienated from each other, and we have no sense of belonging. Instead, we have a deep down sense of insecurity. But listen, this story is the most loved story, I think, of all of Jesus' teaching. Why? Because that's not where the story ends. The story is all about good news. The story isn't just that we alienated ourselves, but get this, here's the whole message. Listen, are you ready for this? Because here's the whole point and the message of this story. The point is point number 3. God's whole purpose is to restore the joy of belonging through grace. Through grace. And if you want to see it, you got to look at the context. Look at chapter 15, look at verse 1. So you've got tax collectors and sinners. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to who? Jesus. They all wanted to be around Jesus because they enjoyed being around him. But then verse 2, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So verse 3, it says, so he told them this parable. Who's he talking to? Now, granted, the sinners and tax collectors are in the area, but the people that he's engaging with in this moment are the Pharisees, because listen, what Jesus is doing is he's saying, listen, you actually don't know who God is. You've got a wrong perspective, a wrong understanding. If you're complaining that I'm welcoming sinners and I'm spending time eating with them and having fellowship with them, if you're upset about that, it's because you actually don't understand who God is. And so here's this son, and he is in this mess, and he's in the mess, by the way, because of his choices. But then it says he comes to his senses. He wakes up. He realizes how foolish his life is, the decisions that he's made that have put him in this place, how foolish it would be to stay there starving because his father has servants who have more than enough food. And so he decides in that moment of spiritual awakening that he's going to do, and this is, by the way, what everybody decides to do in this moment. You know what they try to do? They try to approach God through man-made religion. And here's what that looks like. I'm going to go make myself right with him. I'm going to earn it back. I am going to go back and I'm going to say, I'm not worthy, so let me come on as a hired servant, because what I'll do is I'll work this off. I'll work my way back. I'll earn it. I'll pay off the debt that I owe because I wasted all that money. I'm going to have to do that. I'm going to go to church. I'm going to give money in the offering plate. I'm going to serve. I'm going to help the poor. I'm going to make my way back to you. I'm not worthy to be called your son, so I'll earn it. And listen, he's got part of it right. He's absolutely right. He is not worthy to be called a son of the Father. He's not. But the Father will have absolutely nothing to do with his man-made approach, with this approach of I'll earn it back. So the son gets up and he's on his way back home. He's got his plan in his mind. And as he's still a long way off, the Father looks and he sees him. You got to understand what this means, and you're just going to have to track with me on this for a little bit, and I'm going to go into this for a bit because the beauty of this picture is absolutely breathtaking. Because I want you to get this. Up to this point in time, the Pharisees were probably all nodding their heads. They're all going, yep, that's right. He's not worthy. Yep, that's right. He better go back and earn his way back in. There's no way that father should welcome him back without a little smack upside the head and get your butt to work, because there is no way you're coming back in here without cleaning yourself up first. The Pharisees are probably all nodding their heads in this moment, but suddenly Jesus turns the tables. Because here's the father. And he sees his son a long way off, which, by the way, means here's a father who's been watching and looking for his son to come home. He's been on the lookout. A number of years back, my son William, we went to Brookfield Zoo. You know, in Brookfield Zoo, they've got that big park in the middle for kids to play on. This was, by the way, when Will was still in a baby carriage, so he's pretty young. And my parents were with us. My dad's a state police officer, which means he has lots of really good stories, not for that situation, but he's telling me these stories that we've got to really be careful because there's people that are going around chloroforming kids and putting them in strollers and kidnapping them. That's my dad. And so here we are, we're at this, so he's telling me these stories as we're at this park where there's like hundreds of kids just running around all over the place. And so I'm trying to focus on Will, keep my eye on him while he's telling me this story. And all of a sudden I lost him. I couldn't see him. And I'm like, Dad, stop. We got to go I can't find him. And so we start looking for him, and we literally cannot find him. Sarah and my mom, they get involved, and we're running around the park screaming his name. No response, no response, no response. And so, of course, I'm picturing what my dad just told me. And so I'm freaking out. And so I grab one of the park people who's driving around in a car, and I'm like, you're going to drive me around, and we're going to look for my son because he's missing now. And so I get in one of those like little cars, and we're driving around. I'm screaming his name. We're yelling for him. We're looking for him. Do you understand that the father in this moment, this is how he feels? That he's watching, he's looking for his son in the exact same way. If any father in the room, if you've ever lost your child and didn't know where they were, that feeling that you have, the father is looking for his son. And when he sees him a long ways off, do you know what he does? He gets up and he runs. He gets up and he runs. You know, we finally found him. You know where we found Will? He was actually still on the park, but he found this one little spot that he could crawl into underneath something. And he couldn't hear us screaming at least this is what he says. He couldn't hear us screaming his name. I think he was trying to torture us, but so he was still there. But when I saw him, I wasn't angry. I wasn't yelling at him. When this father sees his son a long way off, he gets up and he runs. And it wasn't like a little jog, right? This father, you've got to see this. He literally gets up and it is a sprint. He is running as fast as he can to his son who's still a long way off. Something that no noble father would have done at that time, because that wasn't self-respecting. That wasn't something of honor. But he gets up and he sprints at his son, not in anger, not in judgment, no fists raised. He runs to his son and he crashes into him with his arms open. And can you see it? Him slamming into his son as he wraps his arms around him, not thinking about the filth that he's covered in, the fact that he's dirty and he's been with pigs and that he smells and he hasn't had an opportunity to get cleaned up. And not only does he throw his arms around him, but he kisses him. Not just once, but over and over and over. And the son begins his monologue. He's got his plan, his man-made approach. And he says, Father, I've sinned against you and before heaven, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And the father won't let him keep going. The father speaks over him. And when he speaks over him, he doesn't speak to the son. He speaks to the servants. And he says, go get the robe, go get the ring, go get the sandals. And listen, every single one of those pieces is the father saying, I will have nothing to do with you trying to earn your way back in. You don't earn your way back in. You're not going to be a son someday. You're a son right now. Right now. In this moment, the robe was the robe of honor. Not just any robe, it was the best robe. That ring to put on his finger was most likely the signet ring of the family. It represented that he was being restored back to his place in the family as being a representative of that family. Sandals were not given to servants because they were too expensive. The father in that moment is saying, you are not a servant. You right now in this moment are my son, not because you deserve it, not because you're worthy, but because of my grace and love for you. And it was so radical because everybody that was listening to Jesus knew that he wasn't just making up a story about a father, that in that moment that Jesus was going, that's who God is. That's who God is with you. With you. And you've got to think about how radical this is for just a moment, because listen, Bill Giovanetti, who used to be a pastor at Grace Point years ago, he actually had a post that I saw just this last week on Facebook that you've got to think about this. If this story were in any other religious book, the ending would be radically different. If in the Muslim Quran, he would have to repay his father fourfold and have his hand cut off. If in the Buddhist sutras, he would be reincarnated as an earthworm and have to scale the ladder of perfection from the dirt up. If in the Hindu Vedas, he would suffer karmic justice, what goes around comes around. Only in the Bible, with its God of love, can the story end the way that Jesus ends it. The loving father not only runs to the pierced, tattooed, lice-ridden, STD-risking son, he also embraces him, showers him with kisses, and wastes even more money by throwing a budget-blowing party. Love. The Bible owns it. Self-giving, self-sacrificing, urgent, passionate, crazy love from God's immaculate heart to our putrid souls, restoring the joy of belonging by His grace alone. If you want joy now, you cannot have it without belonging. And if you want belonging, this is how you get it. Number one. So last few things on your notes. Number one is you've got to own the fact. You have to own the fact. Sorry, I just lost my notes. You have to admit the emptiness of belonging without God. You have to admit it, that you have done what the Son has done. You said, I'm going to go my way. I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to take what God's given me. I'm going to live my own life. And what it's led to brokenness with insecurity and a lack of belonging. Number two, you've got to recognize, you've got to see that the real place of belonging is not anywhere if it's not with the Father first. If you want that belonging, you've got to acknowledge that the first place you've got to find that, the first place that you have to find it is with God. And by the way, here's why it's the first place. Because listen, in every other relationship, if people love and accept you, they haven't fully loved and accepted you because they don't know everything about you. God is the only one who knows everything about you and still loves you. Everything. It's the one place of true belonging that frees you to belong anywhere else. And number three, you've got to accept the embrace. You've got to receive the embrace of God. And the only way that you receive the embrace of God is to give up on your own efforts to try to make yourself right with Him. It's the only way. Everything about the Father in this story is ultimately pointing us to who God is and how we actually approach Him. And Jesus is saying, you've got to understand, you aren't going to get back in by being the servant who does everything that you can to pay God back. That's not how it works. Galatians chapter 4, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman under the law, to redeem those who were under the law. Listen, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Jesus Christ came, nailed to the cross, arms spread wide open, so that God might embrace you by His grace as a child adopted through His finished work. Not through your efforts. You don't earn it. It's not something that's progressive. It's something that you receive. Jesus, listen, in John chapter 1, as John's introducing who Jesus is, it says, but to all who did receive Him, who believed in His name, He gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. Who did what? Who received Him, who believed in His name. Romans chapter 4, verse 5, but to the one who stops working but believes, to him it is counted as righteousness. To the one who says, listen, I'm not worthy, but not only am I not worthy, but I can't earn it, I can't pay you back. The only hope that I have is Jesus and what he's done for me. That's all I've got. I've got nothing else to cling to. Nothing in my hands I bring. It's only to Christ I cling. That's all I've got. Let me ask you a question. Are you an adopted child of God? Are you? And let me just challenge you for just a moment. I want you to really answer that in your head. Are you an adopted child of God? And if you say, I'm trying, then you don't understand the gospel. Because you either are or you're not. You either have been rescued and saved or you're not. You're either adopted or you're not. You're either a child or you're not. There's no in between. There's no progression. There's no process of getting there. We tend to not really embrace the fullness of the wonder of this moment that God says in this moment, the moment you believe, you're a son today. Fully, right now, accepted, loved, forgiven, affirmed, you are his child. Today, right now. And the question you've got to ask is, have you been taken up in that embrace? Have you trusted and believed that that's true for you? If you haven't, then that's the invitation. Number 3, practice belonging with the Father. Practice belonging with the Father. And here's what that means. Here's what that means. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16 says, let us with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find help, the grace to help in time of need. It says draw near to where? A throne. Why? Because he's a king. But he's not just a king. And if you want to understand the radical nature of this relationship, let me just think of it like this. Imagine a throne room. The king is on the throne and his noblemen are standing around, and suddenly the doors burst open and in runs someone charging straight at the king. If that is just someone from the kingdom or just anyone, a random person, what's going to happen in that moment? At best, they're going to get tackled and arrested. At worst, they're going to be dead. Why? Because you don't get to approach the king that way unless the person who just burst through those doors and is rushing as the king is a son. Because in that moment, the son has rights that even the nobles don't have. In that moment, that son can run straight up and jump into the lap of his father. And see, we draw near to the throne of grace, not just as subjects, but as sons. And what does that mean? Practice the belonging with the Father. Run and jump into his lap. Enjoy the relationship that has been given to you through Jesus Christ. You have been adopted. You are his child through the finished work of Jesus Christ. Practice belonging with the Father. Listen to him in his word. Talk to him in the context of prayer. Enjoy his presence in the worship with his people. And here's the last thing. Practice belonging with his people. Not only does his grace bring us back into belonging with him, but it brings us back into belonging with each other. And what does this mean? Here's what it means. Number 1, just 2 quick things. Number 1 is that you have to get close enough to people for them to sin against you, to sin against them, for them to forgive you and you forgive them. You have to actually, if you're going to practice belonging, you have to actually get into a relationship, which means it has to go beyond a hi, a smile, and a wave and a handshake on Sunday morning. It's why we have connecting groups and life groups and men's ministry and women's ministry, is to provide opportunities and doors. It's why we offered the New Friends dinners, is because we're meant to belong, and you cannot practice that staying on the outside. But here, look, last thing. We practice belonging by making it our goal to let other people know that they belong with us. Embracing them the same way that God has embraced us through Jesus Christ. If we're going to have joy today, you cannot have it apart from from belonging. And here's how you experience that belonging: through the radical, never-changing, unending grace and love of God poured out for us through Jesus Christ.